Caring for Kids God's Way, a biblical counseling certificate program in child advocacy developed by the American Association of Christian Counselors through Light University. Your ministry is to be a Galatians 6:2 helper. Ours is to equip you with the highest level of advanced training from the world's leading Christian counselors. 24 experts teaming up to create the most comprehensive child studies curriculum for the personal classroom. May the Lord bless your study as you begin caring for kids God's way. He's founder of Faithful and True Ministries, director of the AACC's Institute for Healthy Sexuality, a consultant for hospitals and treatment centers throughout America, and author of many books, including The Pornography Trap. Caring for Kids God's Way presents Dr. Mark Laaser with Teaching Our Kids About Sex.
I'm Dr. Mark Laaser, and welcome to this teaching segment on talking to your kids about sex. This is an incredibly important topic in our current cultural time because, as we all know, we are being bombarded on a daily basis with sexual stimuli. One of the things that I worry about is that if we, as parents, don't talk to our kids about sex, the world is going to do that. There are so many messages on television, radio, magazines, and just pervasively in our culture that if we as parents don't take the time to teach our kids healthy sexuality, God's plan for sexuality, then the world and people like Hugh Hefner and others are going to be teaching them things that are just completely untrue and incorrect. I know that that was true for me because I grew up in the 50s and 60s, and the generation of parents that I was raised with was the greatest generation, but they were themselves, I think, not comfortable at all with talking about sex. So in my case, where did I learn about it? Well, I learned about it by looking at various kinds of pornographic magazines. I learned about it by talking to my friends on the playground. Neither of these places was very healthy information about sexuality. I'm not trying to shame any of you watching this about doing this. I'm trying to challenge you that we as Christian parents, pastors, counselors, youth leaders, and youth pastors, we really need to be involved in this education with our kids. In this video, I'm going to try to just walk you through some basic principles that I have that I think are important for this conversation. And then I'm going to also give you just a few brief things to think about in several different age ranges for kids. So first of all, I went to a Presbyterian seminary that taught you in the tradition of Jonathan Edwards that you're supposed to convince people of sin before you tell them the gospel message. So I'm just going to give you a few statistics that illustrate the importance of this topic. First of all, according to a recent survey that came out from the National Survey of Family Growth, they surveyed a population of teenagers between the ages of 15 and 19. 55% of the boys reported that they had had sexual intercourse, again, not married, by the age of 19. And also, sadly, 53% of the girls said that they had had sexual intercourse before the age of 19 and before being married. So, obviously you can tell from that well over half of our teenagers are quite sexually involved to the point of sexual intercourse. And this is, in many ways, a national epidemic. Another statistic that came out from this same study was that about 50% of these teenagers had engaged also in oral sex. So some of them might have thought that they were still being virgins by not practicing sexual intercourse, but also at least half of them had had oral sex. 54% of the girls reported that they had, and 55% of the boys. So again, these are two very kind of sad statistics. And here's a third. In this study, 14% of the girls said that by the age of 25, they had engaged in a same-sex type experience. So that, as we know as Christians, the homosexual community has had quite an influence on not only all of us, but certainly on our teenage populations. And the idea of engaging in a same-sex experience as just maybe even a kind of a rite of passage or a normal kind of thing has been shown to us in various cultural forms. And so, that's a really sad statistic that 14% of our girls have been involved in that. Finally, and this is the one that really concerns me the most because on an average daily basis I'm working with men who have been involved in sexual addiction, but the statistic is that When I was growing up, back in the 60s, we could kind of predict that a boy would probably see pornography somewhere between the ages of 11 to 13. It might have been in their father's collection of pornography. It might have been that a friend showed him that. Today, sadly, what we know is that the age that a child first sees pornography has gone way down to the age of 5. Now, think about that, because where is this happening? Well, if you're involved in culture at all, you know that the place where this is happening is primarily on the internet. And just think about the fact that 5-year-olds, even in kindergarten, are learning quickly how to access computer keyboards, how to do computer programs, and certainly how to get on the internet. So it's not uncommon today for a 5-year-old child to be completely and explicitly exposed to the most perverse kinds of pornography. If not that on the internet, just think about what the situation in our country is today when you just are in a grocery store and you check out in the various checkout lanes, and you'll know that they have some of these very sophisticated magazines like the National Enquirer or Cosmopolitan magazine there, so that as a last act you'll buy them. But if you're down at the level of a 5-year-old's eyes, you can imagine what kind of messages that they're taking in, what kind of visual images they're taking in about sexuality. So, as much as we parents would like to perhaps put off this conversation until our kids are teenagers, today we must begin to think about the fact that we're going to have to start talking to our kids at much earlier ages. One of the things that's happening to us in our counseling center is that we're getting calls from parents that are concerned about having found their teenagers on the internet. They're young people on the internet. And even the other day, I got a call from a parent who said that their 5-year-old son had accessed the internet and had used a family credit card to buy $673 worth of pornography on the internet. So again, I'm trying to challenge all of you about the fact that we need to be involved in this conversation. Now, there are some things that I think we need to think about first, and you'll be looking at these on your screen, but these are just kind of 3 basic principles that I think are important. One of them is, as we begin to think about talking to our kids about sexuality, what is it that has prevented us from feeling comfortable doing that? Well, first of all, we could say that sexuality and discomfort about it is maybe a part of original sin. I mean, the Bible does talk about the fact that when Adam and Eve were in the Garden of Eden, before they had committed original sin, they were naked, and the Bible says not ashamed. After the original sin, then they started putting on clothes. So it could be that this discomfort that we have about our own bodies is not God intended, but it's something that's part of that inability that we have in our sin nature to depend on God. So all of us probably have some level of discomfort with these sexual conversations, and some of it could go back to our own story. So that's my first point. As you're getting ready for this conversation, think about what your own story was like. And I'm going to talk to you a little bit about each of these points here in just a minute. The next thing, for those of you that are watching this as parents, husband and wife, or if you're watching this as a single parent, one of the things that I think we forget to do is to talk to each other. In other words, husbands and wives talking to each other about sexuality. I mean, how many couples engage in sex, have sexual intercourse, produce children, but have never talked to each other about sexuality, or certainly never talked to each other about God's plan for healthy sexuality? Now, again, there could be a variety of reasons for that, which I'll talk about also here in a minute. But I think it's critical, particularly for parents who are wanting to talk to one of their children, to talk to each other first, to get their game plan together, to understand what they want to teach, to have a common way that they're going to go about doing that. And then the last thing that I think is first things first, or some point that we need to really consider as we go into this conversation, is what is, in fact, God's plan for healthy sexuality? Now, just a challenge for the moment. How many of you would say that in your experience going to church, Sunday school, youth group, you've had a teaching or teachings about what God's plan is for healthy sexuality? Now, remember, it doesn't count that you might have heard a sermon about what not to do. That's not what I'm talking about here. One of the first ways I learned this is I was invited to go down to Abilene Christian University and address all the students in their student assembly on a given morning. And I was asked to meet with the student leaders before I was kind of allowed to go in there and speak to them. And I thought this was going to be kind of a session where they got to ask me some questions. They didn't have any questions for me, but they had a whole lot of things to say. And the main point of it was, Dr. Laser, we hope you're not here today, this morning, to talk to us about what we're not supposed to do. We hope you're here today to tell us what we should think about doing. What is God's plan for healthy sexuality? Our parents, our teachers, our pastors, our youth leaders, they've been telling us what not to do, but we haven't had anyone telling us what we should do. So that's the next thing I want you to think about. What is God's plan? We may need to spend time studying Scripture. We may need to read what few resources there are out there about this topic. One of the things that I've discovered recently, and this is maybe a little bit interesting for some of us evangelical Protestants to be thinking about, but our recently deceased Pope was quite a prolific writer about sexuality. And there is in Catholic teaching just a wealth of information about God's design for the human body, how we are to keep our bodies sacred, how our spirits and our body are a wholeness and a oneness, and how we are to use our bodies, even in the act of sexuality and marriage, to honor God. Well, we all need to be studying and to be learning more about this. And if you're watching this and you're a Christian counselor or a pastor or a youth pastor, I challenge you to study, think, write, what is God's plan for healthy sexuality? Now, let's go over each of these points one by one. The first one is understanding your own story. I like to have fun with this when I'm speaking to various parents or various audiences, because I think it can be quite humorous and maybe tension reducing if we go back to remember some of the stories that we can remember from our own youth about how we ourselves learned about sexuality. So that's the question. How did you learn about sex? And what were some of the messages about sexuality that you learned? As I'm doing this video, I'm 55 years old, so I was raised in the 50s and early 60s. One of the categories to think about is, what did you learn about sexuality on television and in the media, magazines, radio, music, and so forth? Well, those of us that are my age, baby boomers, so to speak, we watched the Cleavers sleep in separate beds. We watched any couple that was on TV, not be in the same bed. So we learned basically that sexuality was somehow supposed to happen even though couples didn't sleep together that directly. We learned from shows that people maybe didn't even touch each other all that much, didn't seem all that romantic. Think about the Nelsons and the Cleavers and all those kind of people. What did they teach us about relationship? Well, recently, for those of you that are much younger watching this, think about what television and culture and movies and so forth have been teaching us recently. So the first question about how you learned about sexuality is, whatever age you were raised in, what was the teaching or the messages of culture? And then when you get a hold of some of that, ask yourself the question this: what are some of the mythologies that I was raised with? Are these things that I learned culturally, are they true? When I was growing up, those messages that I just mentioned about what couples are like, were those really true? But more importantly, in the 80s, 90s, and now in the 21st century, some of the messages about sexuality, is it really true that all people are having sex all the time? Is it really true that the more sex we have, the better it is? Is it really true that the more sexual practice you have, the better at sex you're going to get? Well, all the scientific evidence would clearly point to really the truth of God's plan. There was a major sexuality study at the University of Chicago a number of years ago in which they said that people who are monogamous in marriage and have not acted out outside of that marriage, they tend to be a whole lot happier in marriage. The same study also showed that those who wait to be sexual in marriage and have not been sexual before marriage, they tend also to have more contented, happy relationships in marriage. Science continually proves the truth of God's message about sexuality, but think about that in relationship to what our current culture is teaching. Now, another place to have fun thinking about this would be to think about, obviously, what did you learn about sex at home? Now, many of us can go back and we could think about that one talk, that one conversation that we had with our same-sex parent. In other words, me with my dad or my wife with her mother. I mean, what was that one-time event that we had that they were incredibly nervous and uncomfortable with it, and what was the message there about sexuality? Well, you know, I sometimes wonder how I even biologically got here, because my parents didn't even seem to want to talk at all about sex. My mom never talked to me about it. My dad had that one-time conversation. And as true for many of us, I think I was age 14 or 15, so by this point I'd already been looking at pornography for 2 or 3 years. I knew all about sexuality from those who were wanting to teach me. Again, the pornographers, and my dad was just way too late. Now, you know the proverbial question that your parents are always going to ask you? It's like, if you have any questions, just come to me. Well, how many of us are born with that set of questions inside our head that we know how to ask them? It's our parents' responsibility, really, to tell us about the information without us knowing what we're supposed to ask about. Think about, those of you that are a little bit older, what it was like to be at school. And you, let's say, went to gym class one day, and I know, at least in my day, after gym class, we were all forced to take showers. Well, remember that time, the first time you had to do that, and you were parading around in front of your friends and peers, naked for the first time in your life, and you'll remember that that class, you know, for just a moment became a class not in physical education, but in comparative anatomy. Remember the shame, the embarrassment, the humiliation. Some of us were too big, some of us were too small, some of us were too hairy, some of us were too fat, too skinny. And we were all feeling that sense of body shame and humiliation that is pretty normal for an adolescent to experience. What would it have been like if you'd gone home that day and around the dinner table after your father or mother prayed, your dad said, "What was it like in school today?" And you said to them, "I'm glad you raised that question. Could we discuss what it was like to feel a sense of sexual shame today in physical education class?" You know, all of our families, you know, didn't have that kind of comfort. What would that have been like, though, if we could have brought that loneliness, that sense of humiliation and estrangement, if we could have brought that home and had healthy conversations with maybe even both of our parents about those kinds of things? Well, think about your stories, and even those of you that are watching this, if you're watching this with other people, you know, take a moment to have a conversation about what you remember about those conversations with your parents. You women, there's a whole category, and I won't get into it right now, about what it was like for your mother to get you ready for adolescence and menstruation. I mean, I've heard all kind of stories about a book somehow that was handed you, and again, your mother said, "Read this, you'll be ready," and the materials you need are someplace for you to access. My favorite are the stories where women have told me that their mothers put the book and these materials in some drawer in their room, and they were supposed to somehow magically find them when they needed it. Well, you know, some of these stories are actually kind of sad, but also I think we can kind of have fun today remembering back to what that was like. You can also think about another category, which would be, what did you learn about sex at school? Today, in most of our public schools, and certainly in our Christian schools and our home schools, there is curriculum available to teach kids about sexuality, at least in terms of the biology of it, the mechanics of it, and so forth. And in the Christian schools, the Christian curriculums, there are some also some moral, theological teaching about sexuality. Not as much as we need, but there is some. But when you were growing up in your school system, what was the level of sexual education that you received? I can't recall myself a message about sexual education until I got into roughly my junior year in high school, and at that point, basically all the messages were about how to not get pregnant and how to not get a sexually transmitted disease. So again, it was pretty much all negative teaching. And then finally, my favorite category, and I've already mentioned it, is what did you learn about sexuality at church? And you know, that's kind of a fascinating question because most of us didn't learn anything at church. But remember back to maybe what the stories were of the conversations in small groups, in a Sunday school class. Maybe your youth pastor brought up the topic, you know, at some point or another. You know, what was the teaching? I remember that in my church, actually, my dad, who was the pastor, was fairly progressive. He brought in a doctor from the local community who was willing to come and talk to the kids that day. And the doctor brought his nurse, and the nurse took all the girls and put them in a separate room, closed the door, locked the door. The window that was in the door was covered with newspaper, and so the girls were literally kind of locked away. Now, what was the message in and of itself in that? And while they were in there, you could hear the motion picture projector, one of those old 16 millimeter projectors running. And to this day, I don't know what the girls saw or what they learned or what that was all about. And when you think about that, the girls kind of remained a mystery. Now, in the main room, in the big room, this doctor had brought one of these old slide projectors, and he had a slide of every sexually transmitted disease he'd ever seen. Now, when we were done watching this lecture and all of this stuff that he was showing us, we thought for, I think, a while that if we ever thought about sex again, something horrible was going to happen to our body. Well, is that not kind of consistent with a lot of the messages that we received that were so negative? But the point of all of this is, as you prepare to talk to your kids about sexuality, understand what your messages were from these different categories that I talked about. The next part of this is, I think we need to talk to each other. Now, this can be kind of a daunting thought, because if we haven't talked to each other about sex before, all of a sudden doing it in preparation for talking to our kids can be kind of a frightening experience. One of the things to think about, though, is to share stories like about the categories I was just talking about. Don't make it that intimidating. Just go back and share with each other what it was like when you were a child, an adolescent, a teenager. What were some of the fears, some of the thoughts, some of the feelings, some of the experiences of education that you had? Start out with something like that that's a little less intimidating. And then, if you're very courageous, one of the things that I think can help the conversation with your own kids is there anything about your own sexual history that you haven't told your spouse? It could be, for many of us parents, that one of the reasons why we're uncomfortable talking to our kids about sex is that we ourselves are hiding sexual secrets. So in other words, you might want to get some help from a counselor or a pastor if you're a parent watching this, in terms of if there's sexual secrets in your relationship. And you may even need to schedule an appointment with a Christian counselor to have that conversation. But again, I think it's vital in order to be able to talk to your kids. The next part of this conversation could be, is there sexual tension in your relationship? Are you having issues of sexuality? Just ask yourself this question. I mean, if you're having problems with sex yourself, how are you going to feel comfortable talking to your kids about sexuality? I am always, flabbergasted by the amount of couples who are dealing with sexual dysfunctions and sexual tensions that they have never talked to about with anyone. Today, as we know, there are competent Christian counselors who are able to help you with this. In AACC teaching videos, for example, Joyce and Cliff Pinner, Doug Rosenau, there are Christian voices who are writing and teaching about healthy sexuality in terms of all the vast array of information we've learned from the medical community. And there's no reason today to exist for any period of time with these sexual dysfunctions or tensions that you have, because there's just lots and lots of help available to you. Would you be willing, this is the last point I would make in this whole category, would you be willing to tell your story to your own children? I get asked this question all the time because I work with men who have had sexual addiction histories, and they often wonder, should they tell their own sons and daughters what their story was all about? I look at it this way. When I was 11, 12, 13, I had looked at pornography for the first time. What would have been more helpful to me? To think, as I did think, that my dad would never have thought these kinds of thoughts. My dad, who was a mighty powerful pastor, I used to think that my dad must not have ever had an inappropriate sexual thought in his head. And that just made me more lonely. Well, why am I not like Dad? I'm having all these lustful thoughts. All the other boys seem to be doing that, but no one from an adult perspective was talking to me. Would it not have been better, even if my dad had struggled himself with pornography or other forms of sexual acting out, wouldn't it have been better if he had come to me and told me what it was like to struggle with those things and where there was a way out through our relationship with Christ? Would not that have been more normalizing? Would that have not made me feel less alone and ashamed and embarrassed? Well, think about that, because I believe it's rather an ethical imperative to talk to your kids about even your own story to help them feel less alone. Now, with that kind of intimidating thought, let's go to the third point that I was making about preparation, and that was, as parents or as youth leaders, as therapists, counselors, I mean, what is our understanding of God's design for healthy sexuality? Now, I don't have a long time on this teaching segment to go into lengthy biblical discussion of this, but let me just make some basic points. As we can well imagine and all know, based on the commandments, the story about man and a woman coming together and forming a one-flesh union in Genesis 2, later repeated by Jesus, later repeated by Paul in Ephesians 5, sex is intended for marriage, and it's only to be consummated in a relationship between a husband and wife. And as we all know, there's lots of debate these days about what all of that means. But as Christians, we can be crystal clear that God intends for sex to be experienced not before marriage, not outside of marriage, not before you're getting married, even if you know you're going to get married, but it's only to be experienced in the context of the sacred covenant of marriage. Our pastor the other day was preaching a sermon, and he said something very sad, that of all the couples that he is preparing now to get married in our church, well over half of them are living together. Well, think about that. That is totally outside of God's plan for healthy sexuality. Now, why is that? Does God just want to be a kind of a spoil sport? Does he want to, cause us, pain and grief and aggravation? I mean, why would God allow us as human biological beings to be so sexually attracted to so many things and then ask us to be faithful to only one person in marriage? And I think because God's plan for sexuality is clearly this, that sex, in order for it to be satisfying, can only be truly satisfying, even from a biological perspective, if there is a spiritual union between a husband and a wife. There is something about sharing Christ together between a husband and wife that makes sex, biologically speaking, even more satisfying. I've seen this over and over and over again with any number of couples that my wife and I work with, or any number of men that I've worked with. I've talked to men who've had sex with hundreds of different partners, and they tell me consistently, 100% of the time, no matter how much sex that they get, it was never enough. In other words, frequency of sex is not the answer to the question of being sexually satisfied. Variation of sexual activity is not the answer to being sexually satisfied. In God's plan for healthy sexuality, for us to be biologically satisfied, for our lust to be satisfied. When Paul was talking about there's so much sexual immorality in the world, go ahead and get married, what he meant is not about frequency of sex, not about availability of sex. It's about sex being consummated in the spiritual union of a husband and wife. That takes sex to a whole nother level that the world has no clue about. Believe me, the world has no clue about that level of sexuality. I mean, we know about all this recreational kind of stuff that's out there. None of that is satisfying. It may be biologically satisfying for 5 to 10 minutes, but that's all. Sex between a husband and a wife in the sacred covenant, spiritually, of marriage, that is sexually satisfying for a lifetime. You could have sex one time a day or one time a year. That would be satisfying in God's design for healthy sexuality. Well, obviously we're to be monogamous. In the Bible, just so you're aware of this, the word lust appears a number of different times, and every time it appears in the Bible, it refers also almost synonymously to an act of selfishness. So lust, in other words, gratifying our sexual desires for purely biological intention, is a selfish act. On the other hand, when purity and monogamy and faithfulness is talked about in the Bible, it's usually always referenced in relationship to selflessness. When Paul talks about marriage in Ephesians 5, he starts out by talking about this is about the relationship of Christ to the church. We are supposed to be sacrificial in our attitudes to one another. Healthy sexuality is not about selfishness, it's about selflessness. And finally, I think the Bible would challenge us to have a vision for healthy sexuality in marriage. These days, 9, 10, 11, 12-year-old kids are going to get turned on with all kinds of sexual messages. They're going to be obviously attracted to the opposite sex and so forth. And now we're going to ask them to wait for at least 10 years to get married and have sex. So what must we also help them with? And that is what I would think is a vision for healthy sexuality. We need to be teaching them, again, this message that I was just trying to briefly explain, that sex is for the sacred covenant of marriage. So in other words, we don't just tell them, this is what you don't do. I mean, something's going to fall off. You're going to get diseased or something if you engage in sexuality. That's not what we need to be telling them. We need to be modeling to them, telling them, teaching them that there is something about sexuality when a man and a woman are spiritually connected that is so much more special. And basically, we're going to be asking them to trust us on that and to make a commitment to that vision. Well, again, even as I'm talking about this, I'm aware of the fact that even in my own thinking, since there hasn't been a whole lot of teaching about this, I'm in the early stages of my own understanding of it. But I do know that in my own marriage, having been a recovering sex addict, having pursued a variety of pornographic and other things when I was in the depth of my sin, the only thing now today that I know is satisfying with my wife is to be connected to her in a spiritual covenant. And after all of that sex, today the sex that we have is completely satisfying. So we need to be telling those kind of stories to our kids. And I think they will be able to relate to those kind of stories. Now, let's just finally here, before I get to some of the age categories, talk a little bit about just a few basic principles of how to talk to your kids when you're finally going to sit them down. Don't assume that they don't want to talk just because they seem uncomfortable with the talk. Kids are desperate for information, but part of their job is, in their youth, to be kind of intimidated by talking about it with their parents. That's just a natural part of human development. But I have seen in almost every case that when parents take the time to talk to the kids, they are grateful for it later. So don't assume that they don't want to talk to you, and don't assume just because they're quiet that they're not listening. I remember an example with our oldest son, who's now 26. When he was 18, he brought up to me a question that was based on a conversation that I had with him when he was 8. So he had been stewing about this, considering this for 10 years. Finally, in his own life as a freshman in college, the question came up. The temptation was there in his college life, and he came to me 10 years later and brought back that conversation. He was listening when he was 8, even though he might not have let me know that he was involved in that conversation. Don't assume that this is a one-time talk, and that's one of my biggest principles. I believe that one of the greatest mistakes we parents make is that we think we're going to have the talk. It's going to be 5 or 10 minutes, whatever our comfort level will allow, and then we'll get out of there and it will never be raised again. I believe, and you'll see this in just a minute when I talk about various ages, that we begin the conversation early. We don't try to have this major to do, and we just have small bits of conversation along the way. We build upon the conversations as our kids get older, and it's basically what I call a lifetime of conversations. The next principle here is listen. There may be times when your kids are talking to you about questions, and you just need to listen, sometimes even almost intuitively, to what they're trying to say to you. They could have a question about something they see on TV or in a movie, and it may not be a directly sexual question, but they're talking about a relationship that they saw between a man and a woman in some television show. Listen for any hidden questions that might be there about sexuality and be ready to respond. One of the things, by the way, this points to is that as your kids are participating in culture, as they're on the internet, as they're watching television, as they're going to the movies, we need to be involved with them, sitting down, watching some of those things, even forcing ourselves, I think, to listen to some of their music so that we might be able to get at hidden questions when they might come up. The next principle is take time. In other words, don't try to make this a 5 or 10 minute conversation. Schedule time. I know parents who take one of their kids out for dinner, or they schedule special time with them so that they have enough time for this conversation. Talk to your kids together. Now, this is difficult. It may be kind of outside your frame of reference. But when you think about the fact that one of the things we're trying to talk to our kids about is the relationship between a husband and wife. And then we separate ourselves out in terms of talking to either our boys or our girls. In other words, dad will talk to the son and mom will talk to the mother, or mom will talk to the daughter. You know, it's like we're teaching them a lesson even by that division. Just think about it. What would it be like, use your imagination, if your mom and your dad together sat down with you and talked not in explicit ways about their sexual relationship, but about sexuality in general? I think one of the problems that a lot of the men have that I work with is that they remain in mystery or kind of a fog about what their mother might even think about sexuality, and they don't know what women are like. They don't know what women are willing to be intimate or emotional about. I think we can give them a great gift if we're even in the conversation occasionally model to them, talking to them together. It might be the case that with certain topics like menstruation or those kinds of things that, you know, mom only talks to the daughter or so forth. But in terms of general conversations about sex, dating, romance, relationships, think about talking to your kids together. Be positive and not negative. That's a message that I've been trying to teach you already. In other words, I think we have too many negative messages. Think about talking to them about this healthy model of sexuality. One of the principles to kind of keep in the back of your mind, I think, for every no you tell them about, also give them a yes. For every no, there must be a yes. For everything we decide not to do, what is a healthy discipline or practice that we can also commit to doing? So those are just some basic principles. And one last thing, and that is, don't ever have this conversation when you're angry at them. One of my favorite stories about just kind of a normal conversation that needed to happen. And it revolves around the next category we're going into, and that's the age of 0 to 3. There are important messages to teach our kids about, you know, sexuality or their bodies at that age. This involves one of our sons who was going through, as we all do, toilet training. And one day we were at a church picnic, and Jonathan had that urge to go, and we were trying to educate him about what to do in that situation, but we were on a church picnic. There were no toilets available. So what did two boys do? We went out in the woods, and I showed Jonathan how to do his thing. He kind of thought it was great, you know, it was this rite of passage type thing, and he was only like 3 years old. Well, you know, the next day, Deb had him out at a shopping mall, and the shopping mall happened to have some trees in one of the courts there, as you can well imagine. And when Deb turned around, John, having to go, being toilet trained, saw this tree. Remember what he'd done with Dad the day before, and well, you can imagine what happened. Well, of course, you know, when you turn around and see that as a parent, you're going to be kind of initially angry. You've embarrassed me in public. This is a terrible thing. Now, you know, that's a kind of a critical moment, because you could shame a child, and, you know, they could kind of remember that experience for a long time. Or you could decide to take him aside later and educate him about social things and about appropriate things at a time when you're not angry. So never have these conversations when you're angry. Now let me just go through a few basic things in several age categories to think about that we need to be teaching our kids about. And there's a whole lot more information about this that I think we need to learn in terms of how they develop, what their thinking is like morally and emotionally and spiritually. There are those that have written books about this. I know I have a book that details this in greater length, but let me just give you some basic things to think about. And this surprises a lot of parents, but I believe that the foundation for any and all conversations is laid in the ages between 0 to 3. When you think about the important messages that are learned by a child about their body when they are this age, not about sexuality per se, but about their body. What they learn about their body sets up the foundation for what they're going to later learn about sexuality. What is the first thing that they learn to do for their body? They learn how to control it. We were just talking about that. They learn how to control this toilet training challenge that they need to learn, how to control their bowels and their bladder. That's the first act of accomplishment that goes on for a child, in addition to walking and talking and those kinds of things. They learn how to control their body. Think about how we as parents handle that. Do we do it in a shaming way? Do we do it in an affirming way? What are we teaching them about their bodies? Is their body dirty and filthy and they're supposed to do these certain things? Or is their body a normal gift of God? They are fearfully and wonderfully made, and this is a natural thing that they need to learn to do. Another incredibly important foundational piece in this age is to teach them the distinctions between male and female. Now, that can be handled in so many right ways and so many wrong ways as well. It can be handled in an embarrassed way, or it can be handled in a perfectly normal and natural way by just using some of the picture books that are out there that are completely available to show your kids some of the basic differences between a boy and a girl. Now, believe me, in my field, this is incredibly important because later on as teenagers and adults, I see lots of men and lots of women who are completely confused about their identity as a man or a woman. Some of our homosexual community is kind of confused about messages they learn at this age. I had a client, for example, recently whose mother always wanted a girl. He had 3 older brothers. He was her last shot at a girl. He wasn't a girl. She hated that. Between the ages of 0 to 5, she dressed him up in dresses, kept his hair long, put it in ponytails, put little ribbons in his hair. He actually brought into a counseling session pictures of himself at age 4 looking exactly like he would be a little girl. Think about the confusing messages of that. Well, in these early ages, we need to clearly, rationally, in terms of God's design and plan, teach our kids about the differences between males and females. And then finally, it's critically important at this time to begin to teach our kids a message that we'll repeat, but what is safe touch and what is not safe touch. In other words, there are areas of their body that only are theirs, that they are to touch. Adults and others are not to touch those parts of their body. And I think we've been good lately, even in the church, in teaching kids about physical safety in that regard. The next category would be between ages 4 and 9. And at this point, given the fact that kids on average see pornography by age 5, I think whether we like it or not, we better teach them the basic mechanics about sexuality. Now again, there are some very fine books that have completely appropriate illustrations to teach kids about the basic mechanics. I believe that kids can handle that information. Think about what it's like, though, to see these messages out in culture and not know what the real truth about biology is. I think that's far worse than them knowing the truth and maybe having it be more than they can handle. I've never seen it be more than they can handle. All the research would certainly suggest that when kids have the appropriate information, even at this age, they're much less likely to experiment with sexuality with each other then and later on. We need to reiterate about safe touch. We're also beginning to teach kids about the differences between right and wrong sexually. We're going to start having social awareness of relationships at this point. Girls and boys may not like each other during this age. This may change later. And believe it or not, at this point, your modeling of the relationship between a husband and a wife, I think, is critically important. The next age is the one that we classically think of, and that's adolescence, the ages between 10 and 13. One of the things, by the way, we need to think about is that puberty is shrinking in size. I mean, it could be that even some girls are starting menstruation at much earlier ages, but let's kind of assume this is the average age range. We need to help them understand completely how the body changes and how it develops, what puberty is all about. We need to start teaching them that plan for sexuality that's from God that we talked about. That includes giving them this vision during this age of abstinence. I mean, some of the recent studies have shown that kids, even in junior high school, are engaging in sexual intercourse and oral sex. So by the age of 12, a certain percentage of our kids are sexually active. We better educate them about abstinence, a vision for that, practical ways of managing physical desire. Now, by that I mean, we men and women better be prepared to teach our kids some lessons even about masturbation and why masturbation, even though it's not mentioned as a sin in the Bible, might not be a healthy practice. In other words, even though mechanically many of us will experiment with it to know our bodies, in terms of God's design for sexuality, when Jesus talked about lusting in your mind after other people in Matthew 5, he's basically telling us that masturbation depends on thinking about sex. Thinking about sex is something we've got to guard against in terms of that being appropriate thought. So when we're teaching our young people about masturbation, we're going to be teaching them about what they think about and the fact that if they start to engage in a habit of masturbation, it's probably going to escalate into forms of frequency that they're not going to want to do, and it's going to condition them out of being satisfied later on with marital satisfaction in sexuality. There are a lot of things written about this. I know I have an article about this on our website, a complete explanation about how to talk to your kids about masturbation. So there also needs to be specific instruction on pornography, how to guard against it popping up on the internet, what would happen to you if it does, messages about where this comes from, and again, how to avoid it. I see so many teenagers getting in trouble with it, not because they elected to have it pop up, just because it did. So at this point, at this age, we're going to need to do specific internet help and instruction. And then finally, with our teenagers, we're going to need to be talking to them about their identity as they develop apart from us. They're strong, they're growing adults even though they're not adults. In one of the other videos in this series, I think that Dr. Daniel Amen will be talking to us about the fact that our brains at this age are not fully developed to make healthy decisions. So we as parents may need to take over some of those decisions, but at least we need to encourage our kids about their own uniqueness, their own development. We need to make sure that they understand all aspects of sexuality at this point in time, and also the kinds of problems that can develop in sexuality when it can get to be kind of promiscuous, addictive, sinful in nature, problematical, and so forth. We need to teach them how to develop safe friendships. One of the great developments, I think, recently in our culture is that kids have learned how to be friends in heterosexual groups. I think this is a great development. We also need as parents to decide what our policies are going to be about dating and those kinds of things. We need to help our teenagers at this point build their own relationship with God. If they don't have a relationship yet with Christ, we need to talk to them about that. And finally, again, to reiterate, by the time they're teenagers and their hormones are just raging inside their bodies, we need to make sure that they have a commitment to abstinence, a vision for God's plan for sexuality and marriage, and that they themselves develop their own personal vision for why it's important to remain abstinent until they find the man or the woman that God intends for them to marry. Well, I've gone over all these things really fast, and again, I'm just trying to illustrate in various ages that the conversation is an ongoing lifetime conversation. There are certain things to emphasize in each stage of life, and really in some ways the conversation about healthy sexuality never stops. I know that for myself there are always questions that keep coming up, and it's kind of a fun quest with my wife to be able to talk about sexual things even at our advanced age. And as Doug Rosenauer, our colleague, would tell us, sex after 50 can be better than sex before 21. So we all have a lot to learn even as we get older. But anyway, I hope this has encouraged you and challenged you to at least talk to each other as parents and then be willing to have a lifetime of conversations with your children. Thank you for listening, and I hope this has been a blessing for you.